Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. If you had to tell somebody in one sentence what the dialogue Meno is about, there would be a number of different candidates, but I think one of them, for many people, would be this question: what is virtue? That Socrates keeps on asking Meno to try to answer over and over again. And they never do reach a satisfactory point. Towards the end, in the part where they're trying to figure out whether virtue can be taught, there is the suggestion made by Socrates that virtue must be wisdom, which is not particularly helpful, although you're going to see similar things happening in some of the other so-called operatic dialogues, meaning that there isn't any way out, that they don't reach the conclusion that they want to reach. There's an aporia, a blockage of the path, where they treat specific virtues. Here, Meno and Socrates are actually trying to figure out what is not just virtues, what is this virtue or that virtue, what is virtue itself? What is the class of things that are virtue? And if we sort of go through the progression, what we see is Meno has spoken many times about virtue in his own hometown. He gets here and Socrates says, I don't know what virtue is. You say you know what it is. Tell me what virtue actually is. And so Meno says, well, it's easy. There is a virtue for this and a virtue for this. Every human action, every stage of life, every role that a person has a virtue. You could even go further if you wanted to and say, well, animals have their own virtues. Like the virtue of a cat is catching mice. The virtue of a dog is barking at intruders. And when it fails to bark, then it's vicious, or something along those lines, right? And Socrates very quickly says, whoa, that's not what I'm asking you for. Let me be really clear. I want one virtue, and I want the virtue that you give me, the account of virtue, to cover all these sorts of things. I don't want to hear that, virtue is one thing over here and over here and over here, and this guy has his virtue and that guy's got that virtue. I want to know what actually ties all of them together. If I'm talking to you about health, health is not something radically different in one person from another. There's something that you can actually point to, a common element or essence. And then Meno tries again, and poor guy, he really is sort of the straight man to Socrates' comedy, and he's treated a little bit unfairly at certain points. He brings up specific virtues, and he says, well, temperance is a virtue, justice is a virtue, courage is a virtue, piety, dignity or great-souledness. These are all sort of candidates that the Greeks thought were very important. In our own time, whenever I ask my students about what are the qualities that you admire in other people, they bring up things like generosity, honesty, compassion, sense of fairness, which we could talk about as justice. And these are all traits or qualities. And Socrates says, that's good, and you're actually getting a little bit closer, but you're still not there. I want to know the definition of virtue. I want something that tells me what the essence of virtue is. I want to know what is common to all of these instances. If you're going to say that courage and justice and great-souledness or dignity are virtues, tell me what actually connects them together. And he's got this metaphor of bees. He says, if I wanted to know what a bee is, you could point me at this bee and this bee and this bee, but are the bees fundamentally different from each other? Or insofar as they're bees, don't they have something that's common to all of them? Is it possible for you to point me towards that? And here's where Meno has to say, oh, now I understand. I see what you're driving at. Let me try to give that to you, Socrates. And this is where now, if you know the sort of Socrates shuffle, you know that Socrates has got him going down the path that he doesn't realize yet is going to lead to a whole bunch of different frustrations, and Socrates getting likened to a stingray and befuddlement, and then it's going to hopefully lead out of that. So Meno starts out by talking, and this is, again, a very typical, commonsensical, of his own time and culture, Greek way of understanding virtue. Instead of, talking about everybody's different virtues, he focuses on what he thinks is paradigmatic, and it has to do with directing things well or governing. So he's got this example, which is very typical of the culture of the time. The free man, the person who actually has property, the male should be out there doing certain things, governing the city well, taking care of certain affairs. The woman should be in the home, ruling the home, arranging everything. It all falls under her providence, and she gets to act, as the determiner in that case as well. There's a very strict separation in, say, Athenian society, for example. But they both involve directing things well. So whether it's the household or the city, whether it's, this area, or you could even say like craftsmen, a good craftsman directs the things that he's working with well, or directs the workers who are doing the work under him or her well. This is a good candidate. Socrates then says, well, what does this really mean? Let's hash this out a bit more. So directing things well, how do you know if somebody's directing things well? What does that actually entail? Does it entail directing them justly, rightly, fairly? We could translate it in any of those ways. And Meno says, yeah, that's exactly what I'm driving at, Socrates. You got it. Now we're done, right? And Socrates says, well, I asked you for what virtue is, and you've given me a virtue, justice, and you said that justice is part of or involved in what it is to be virtuous. That works for justice, but how is that involved in all these other virtues that you're talking about? And instead of trying to give an account, as he perhaps could have, Meno says, oh yeah, you're right. I'm confusing a part for the whole. And I can't define the whole. If I can't define the whole by just pointing at examples, it sure isn't going to do any good to point at one example and say, well, this is what it is, because there's other virtues. Let me try again, Socrates. So he uses an expression from one of the poets. Again, very common thing to do in ancient Greece, to appeal to some sort of, not just authority in the sense of somebody who is going to solve the problem or who's over us, but people who are assumed to be kind of on the ball, to have something intelligent to contribute. That's why they bother copying out their works, because these poets were purveyors of some sort of gnomic wisdom. And so the poet says to rejoice in the fine or the noble and to have power. Now, Socrates says, okay, so we got to parse this a bit. What does that actually mean? To wish for good things and to be able to acquire them. Is that pretty much what the poet means? And Meno says, yeah, that makes sense. And so then Socrates says, well, not everybody's virtuous, right? But doesn't everybody wish for good things? And Meno, here he's actually sort of on the ball. He says, well, not everybody. I mean, some people actually want bad things. And Socrates goes through this thing and says, well, don't they really think that those bad things are good things? They're under a misconception, and that's why they desire them. Insofar as they think that they're good things, don't they all wish for that? We may disagree about what actually counts as real good things, but we all do desire good things. So that's common to all of us. That can't be a hallmark of virtue because we're not all virtuous. So let's turn to the second part, being able to acquire them. Well, is it always good for us to acquire stuff? What about thieves? If a thief breaks into my house, well, I suppose then they wouldn't be a thief, they'd be a burglar, right? And they're stealing my stuff, and my stuff is good stuff, good things. That's not virtue now, is it? That's not being excellent in any sort of important sense. That person's actually vicious. They're breaking into my house. They're greedy. They're taking more than their fair share. They're unjust. And so Socrates gets Meno to recognize that not only is it a matter of acquiring or sometimes not acquiring. Sometimes not acquiring is the right thing, but that it's going to involve the virtues again. So if somebody is acquiring good things or has the power to acquire good things, it's virtuous if they're actually doing it temperately or justly. That means to be ruled by temperance or ruled by justice or in accordance with those, which means that they would actually have to be virtuous or be taking virtue as the guide. And again, we find that there's a circularity to this process of definition because we asked, what is it to be virtuous? Well, it's to behave in accordance with the virtues. We're back to square one, and we still don't know what it is to be virtuous or to have a virtue or what a virtue is. We have plenty of names, we have plenty of candidates for the virtues, but you might say we've got all these candidates lined up, but we don't know where to put them on stage because we don't know where the stage should be placed. That's a fundamental problem. And when Socrates proposes wisdom later on as sort of the defining quality, since wisdom is actually considered to be one of the virtues, that would fall prey to the same issues that he's pointing out here to Meno. Meno is not smart enough to catch Socrates actually pulling the same game that he just criticized Meno for. But that's perhaps because Plato wrote him that way so that we can then catch it and say, wait a second, Socrates, that wouldn't cut it either. One of the things that we ought to think about is Plato setting the bar too high for being able to define what virtue is? Is it necessarily bad in this case? I don't want to say that this would be allowable in every case, but maybe it's necessary to actually do what Meno's doing, or Socrates steers him into doing, and saying, virtue involves acting justly. Virtue involves acting temperately. It involves acting in accordance with the virtue. That doesn't allow us to define it very well, but it does allow us to develop some sort of understanding of it. That's not an option that's actually explored as such in this, but it is one that somebody like Aristotle will make very central to how we actually acquire virtue, how we come to some understanding of virtue. So in the end, it's a wash. They try out different proposals for what could be the essence, what could be the definition of virtue, what do all virtues have in common, and they're never able to attain it. So Socrates says, well, we still don't know what virtue is.